I am making this video in part because I feel that the elections in the Philippines, both the events that transpired and their political significance, have been horrendously misrepresented by the Western mainstream English-speaking media. And I'm making this video in part because I think the origins of American democracy have been and still are misrepresented by everybody. They're misrepresented by our primary school teachers, high school teachers, university professors, and in the vast majority of erudite books published on the subject. And I'm making this video because the two are linked in a tremendously powerful, tremendously important way. Now, if you have paid any attention to the elections in the Philippines at all, what you have probably heard is that Ferdinand Marcos II, Bongbong Marcos, is a strong man, is a charismatic but dictatorial leader like Julius Caesar. He is someone who has been lifted up by the masses. He is a rich man who has captured the attention, the sympathy, and support of the poor. And for that very reason, ipso facto, we can presume that he is a figure like Caesar. He is a figure like Catiline in ancient Rome, who will destroy the republic, who will use the support of the poor, the support of the common people, to rise to a position of power that allows him to undermine the very democracy that gave him that position of power to begin with. This is one of the most durable delusions in the history of American politics. It is a delusion, it is a leitmotif that Americans were obsessed with at the time of the drafting of the American Constitution, at the time they were debating what kind of republic the United States of America should be. And most people don't know this, they don't understand this, they don't appreciate this, because the version of American history they're taught, and again, this is very directly linked to the Philippines, powerfully, especially directly linked to the Philippines. The version of American history they're taught is that there was this period of debate in which it was asked, and the question was definitively answered, what is the perfect form of democracy for the modern world? And once that debate was over, once that debate was done, once these brilliant people like Thomas Jefferson had said all that there was to say on the matter, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, they worked out all the details. The history of the world thereafter is a process of America conquering and tutoring other nations in teaching them what democracy should be, whether by the carrot or the stick, if you like, right? And the Philippines, in case you don't know, is an example of a country that was quite literally conquered by the United States of America. So is Haiti. We never talk about them. We never think about them, right? There are positive examples of American imperialism. Nobody in their right mind could say that South Korea would be a better country today if it were not conquered by the United States of America. Military occupation by the United States of America has been the salvation of South Korea. And South Korea today is a tremendously positive example of a democracy. Yes, it's completely appropriate to say South Korea was tutored by American democracy. They were also conquered by American democracy. Japan, another positive example. What was that country? What was the country we just had 20 years of war in? Afghanistan. Now we start to get uncomfortable. Iraq. Now we start to get uncomfortable. Haiti. The Philippines. We are so uncomfortable looking back at the last 123 years of American imperialism in the Philippines that we just don't let ourselves think about it at all. There was this one-liner I read in a book on the political history of Laos, and it said very simply, the people of Laos learn a great deal by watching carefully democracy in Thailand. And the people of Thailand learn nothing at all by ignoring the politics of Laos. The people of the Philippines have learned a great deal by watching American democracy. And it is not American democracy only that they know and understand. Every wealthy person in Paris has been to Hong Kong. All right. There are powerful links economically between Paris and Hong Kong. People in the fashion industry, people in design, people in the film industry, people in any kind of industry that manufactures in mainland China, but people in the banking industry, people in the investment industry. Okay. The richest people in Paris, the elite, they've all been to Hong Kong. They've flown to Hong Kong about many times. It may be said in general, the people of France know absolutely nothing about democracy in Hong Kong. They don't know anything about Hong Kong. They don't care about Hong Kong. And flying in and out of Hong Kong to go to Fashion Week or to go to some art galleries or go and drink champagne, staying in a 5-star hotel in Hong Kong, you learn nothing, you appreciate nothing, right? The problem isn't that the millionaires of Paris are mentally retarded. That's not the problem, okay? But they do not get to know Hong Kong the way Filipinos do, okay? The people of the Philippines go and live and work in Hong Kong for years, and they come back and they share that experience, all right? And it's not the millionaires of the Philippines I'm talking about. There are millionaires in the Philippines. In case you don't know, there is a wealthy elite class. They probably go to they probably go to Hong Kong too, right? Yes, nurses, janitors, maids, au pairs, women who take care of newborn children. There are all these stereotypical jobs that people from the Philippines get in Hong Kong. You can break down the statistics and see how many exceptions to the rule there are. There are also stockbrokers. There are people who work in banking. There are also computer programmers. But yes, when I was walking through the streets of Hong Kong, you would walk through huge crowds, huge concentrations of the nurses and nannies, people in those lines of work. And by the way, the women would outnumber the men about 50-1. There would be some men, but it was disproportionately women. Okay, they take that experience. They watch. And sorry, I just want to say this. I know this as someone who's been expatriated and relocated around the world so many times. All right, living and working and struggling to survive in Hong Kong and getting a credit card there and getting a mobile phone there and, watching how democracy works and watching how the newspapers criticize the people in power. And then sometimes the people in power resign because the newspapers caught them being corrupt or the newspapers caught them cheating on their wife. That happened when I was in Hong Kong. They really get to see how democracy in Hong Kong works. And then over the last 30 years, they've seen the way the Communist Party of China destroyed it. All right. The people of the Philippines, they know, they understand Hong Kong in a way that the people of Paris, France never have and never will. All right. And it's the same pattern. All right. The people of the Philippines have learned a great deal from observing the rise and fall of democracy in Hong Kong. And all the wealthy white people in the rest of the world have learned nothing by ignoring it. All right. Okay. I don't know what kind of fucking people you are in my audience. I don't really know. Okay. It's going to sound weird. If you are successful in any field like architecture, finance, any kind of manufacturing, you and all the people you know have flown in and out of Hong Kong. So at some point you've had to go to Hong Kong on business, right? Even I, right? As unsuccessful as I've been, I have had reason to go to Hong Kong at a few different points in my life. Okay. It's been a remarkable crossroads for the wealthiest, most influential people in the world. Okay. Do you know jack shit about Hong Kong? Do you understand, just shall we say, how the system works there? Okay. Well, people from the Philippines do. People from the Philippines, they are politically sophisticated in a way that people in the United States of America in the 1760s were not. And in a way, I'm just being honest with you, redneck English-speaking Canadians, redneck English-speaking Americans, still today are not cosmopolitan this way. People of the Philippines, they share the experience they have going abroad and working in Hong Kong, going abroad and working in Dubai, going abroad and working in California, going abroad and working in so many places around the world. It is a mistake. And I've seen Western mainstream media make this mistake again and again and again. It is a mistake to depict the people of the Philippines in 2022 as having a low level of political education. That's just not true. And there are now hard statistics to back up just how interested they are in politics, just how many hours per day they spend thinking about politics, watching YouTube videos about politics, or reading and exchanging messages on Facebook or Twitter or what have you on politics, right? Because social media is now measuring how many minutes per day, how many hours per day people in the Philippines spend reading about politics, talking about politics, listening to podcasts about politics, radio shows and TV shows about politics that have been reformatted and uploaded onto the internet to be consumed in that form. And they can measure, there's money involved. Ultimately, this is about making money out of advertising revenue and so on. They can measure how the number of hours increases and how it decreases in different periods of time politically. All right. Compared to any other country in the region, who really is at a higher level of political sophistication? Who has a more truly cosmopolitan and profound understanding of how democracy works and how it doesn't work than the people of the Philippines? But the leitmotif I see again and again and again, and I listen to French news, I listen to German news, I don't just listen to American or Canadian news. It's recycled from Cicero here. It's recycled from the old story of the Catalan conspiracy. It's this leitmotif, this fixation we have, very much begins with John Adams, the debates surrounding the writing of the American Constitution. Oh, no. If you give the poor the right to vote, if you give the poor democracy, if you create a democracy, all they'll do is destroy the republic, the same way that happened with Caesar, the same way that happened in the Catalan conspiracy. Now, already there's a really weird, fucked up question. What do you mean? How can you just allude to Julius Caesar as if this is some kind of self-evident slam dunk about democracy and letting the poor have a say in politics? And this is already a bizarre, propagandist misinterpretation and misrepresentation of what happened with the rise and fall of Julius Caesar. Okay, you really want to blame the poor for this? All right, but then these notions are foisted onto Bongbong, Ferdinand Marcos II. Bongbong won the election. Who lost? Why are you describing Bongbong as a strong man? And he's already being preemptively called a dictator in this way, that he's going to, sweep aside democratic institutions. This hasn't happened yet. There's no indication this is going to happen yet. Why are you describing him as a strong man, tyrannical president, instead of the single most famous boxer from the last 50 years who lost? Where is the appreciation in the Western press, in the media, for the fact that a man who is incredibly famous internationally, but even more famous within the Philippines as basically the greatest athlete they've ever had, the greatest boxer they've ever had, a charismatic, literal strongman, one of the only politicians who can pose with his shirt off, right? That the people of the Philippines, fewer than 7% of people, voted for this champion boxer who stood in the same elections. There's no credit given to the people of the Philippines whatsoever. Now, I am not saying that Manuel Pacquiao, whatever we're going to call him, I am not saying that Manny Pacquiao would fit into this notion we have handed down for so many centuries, right, of Julius Caesar's supposed takeover of the Republic, of the Catalan conspiracy, so on and so forth, right? But certainly this apprehension, this fear of the strongman dictator lifted up by the support of the poor who don't know what's good for them, allegedly, right? That's deeply baked into this American view of the history of politics over so many centuries. Doesn't that apply a little bit more directly to the world boxing champion than it does to a man who studied at Oxford University, England, who studied in their PPE program, what used to be known as the Greats? Right? Now, if you guys do not know, this is a really interesting conspiracy theory, frankly. Have you ever looked up how many third world dictators took the course in PPE at Oxford, at Cambridge, at London School of Economics, at one of these universities in England? Have you ever looked up how many sons and daughters of third world dictators were sent to engage in this same course of study? Right now, Bongbong, Ferdinand Marcos II, Bongbong didn't complete the degree. He apparently flunked out or dropped out and ended up with another degree as a substitute because he couldn't get the requisite courses completed or couldn't get high enough grades to actually walk away, pardon me, with this degree in PPE. Nobody is representing him as a man who represents an elite education in politics in the British tradition. And that's what he is. And that's who the Philippine people chose instead of the charismatic strongman, instead of the boxing champion. Ferdinand Marcos, Bongbong, also studied at Wharton School of Economics. Yeah, Wharton Business School, I think it's called. Sorry, I'm getting the name slightly wrong, in the United States of America. And again, reportedly dropped out or flunked out, didn't finish the degree. But if you think a leader in an Asian third world country is so cut off from these cultural influences that were foundational to the creation of the American Republic, to the draft of the American Constitution, okay, you're wrong. It's exactly these cultural influences that he would be introduced to, that he would be tutored in, studying PPE at any of the elite universities in England. Okay, and I've got to tell you something. I spent a lot of time at Cambridge and Oxford, more time at Cambridge than Oxford, nevertheless. What people told me there, and what I read in little bits and pieces here and there also, because I studied the history of a lot of places like Myanmar and so on. My impression is that those programs, they are very actively promoted as the training ground for the next generation of leaders, elected or not, in third world dictatorships. That the professors involved in those programs, they are self-consciously aware that they are a kind of civilizing influence, not just throughout the British Empire, right, but throughout the world. That's what they're trying to do, is help those other countries catch up with the British standard of democracy. And I think you could say generally the British level of civilization. Now, what is this American obsession with Caesar? What is this American obsession with the Catalan conspiracy? I said before very briefly that if you compare the level of political education that the middle class and even the working poor in the Philippines have today to the level of political education that white English-speaking Americans had in the United States in the year 1760 or 1770, I think you would inevitably come to the conclusion that the people of the Philippines today, they have a much deeper, much more sophisticated understanding of what democracy really is and how it works in the real world. In the 1760s and 1770s, what was the education that white Americans had in politics? It comes down to just one name, just one man, just one author, Plutarch. That's how you spell it. You do not need to read the complete works of Plutarch you need to read several of his biographies from Athens, several from Rome. You need to read at least one from Sparta. And you will start to put the pieces together. Oh, these are the raw materials that American democracy emerged from, and more or less simultaneously, French democracy emerged from. So if you think about the progress towards democracy and republicanism as being like a painter sitting in front of a blank canvas, the people of the Philippines today are working with many different colors on their palette, many different colors on their brush, right? They're aware of what life is like in Dubai. They're aware of what life is like in Saudi Arabia. And that awareness is not just shallow. Like everybody in the Philippines knows somebody who has lived and worked in Dubai, right? Like, oh, my cousin's wife went and worked there for a while. Whatever the connection is. And of course, these people share their stories and experiences on social media also, right? But the Philippines, as this massively remittance-dependent economy, as this truly globalized economy, this economy where labor is shared across borders to a tremendous extent, okay? They know what life is like in Dubai. They know what life is like in Hong Kong now. They know what it was like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? They know what life is like in California. And I just want to say this again. Filipinos, they know what life is like in California in a way that a multimillionaire from Paris never will. A very wealthy person from Paris may fly in to LA. When I was last in LA, I saw it. Melissa and I together saw this. There was a certain kind of festival going on that was just for all these people from France who were basically investors in the film industry. So the film industry in Paris is linked to the film industry in LA, probably the fashion industry too, probably a few other industries have those links. But there are quite a lot of Parisians in Los Angeles at any one time. Okay, they fly in, they stay in a 5-star hotel, they fly out. They don't deal with the political reality of Los Angeles in the same way that a Filipino migrant does, whatever their immigration status, frankly, whether they're legal or illegal, but whether they're on a temporary work permit or whatever their status is. They have to deal with getting a driver's license, right? They're dealing with the cops. They're listening to the news and watching what's going on around them. They're really experiencing the advantages and disadvantages of the American system of democracy as it really is, in a way that a millionaire flying in and out of town for a conference never will, right? This can be applied across the board. There is a type of learning that goes on there, right? And they bring that back to the Philippines. And of course, today, they're also just getting on their cell phone and talking to them. I mean, this is a change in the world in the last 50 years, just how easy it is to send a text message, to send an email, to send a Facebook message, to have a phone call. But, an immigrant from the Philippines to California, they might be calling their family back in the Philippines every day or every couple of days and complaining. Guess what? California is not paradise. Oh, yeah, well, in some ways, American democracy works better than the government does back home. But let me tell you, living here, now I see how the healthcare system works here. Now I see how the education works here. Now I see how the cops really operate here. Oh, yeah, they tell you have all these human rights in the Constitution, but all right. If you're thinking about this like painting a picture, okay, people of the Philippines, they have a really rich array of colors that ultimately rooted in empirical experience, not just reading articles that from an incredibly biased source like the New York Times. Sorry, rich people in New York City, what the fuck do they know about the outside world? What do people in New York know about the elections that just happened in the Philippines? It comes from the New York Times, it comes from NPR, it's left-wing radio, it comes from a few sources like this. And really what they know is worth less than nothing at all. I remember also a comment, this was in a letter to the newspaper when I was living in Thailand. And a guy just wrote in and he said, I feel that what's misrepresented most on television here are the people of Thailand themselves. It was such a simple comment, but it really struck me as true. And, he said, when you watch television here, all you see are these wealthy, white-skinned people with these tremendous Roman noses. At that time in Thailand, the number one most popular plastic surgery was rhinoplastic augmentation. People were paying money to have a bigger nose, to have more of a Roman nose. And, he said these people don't look like, don't sound like, and don't share any of the same political concerns as the short, brown-skinned, small-nosed people you meet at the vegetable market. Anyway, it was not a very profound comment in the newspapers. Remember, that really stayed with me because it was so true. I really felt at that time, there's no way you can know what's going on in the politics of Thailand, like right now, right then and right now. There's no way you can know without actually living here and without actually learning the language and actually being here, because it's so misrepresented, And a lot of that misrepresentation, it's not a conspiracy. It's not intentional propaganda, right? The type of people who appear on television at all, the voices that are heard, the faces that are seen on television, right? They are already this very strange misrepresentation of who the people of Thailand are. So remember that sense of living in a bifurcated society. And it's true, they partly just because plastic surgery was so common for the wealthy in Thailand. They looked like two different ethnicities. They're not. They're the same people genetically. But the rich, with their bleached skin and their modified noses and so on, they look totally different from the people who were actually farming the vegetables, the people who were selling the vegetables in the market. And politically, their concerns and they lived in two different worlds. And only one of those worlds was visible on television. Only one of those worlds was visible on the internet, not the other. Sorry, I've been taking quite a while to get to the end of this metaphor. All right. The people of the Philippines have real experience living in these places and seeing how the political system works, not just in theory, but in practice. And when they're painting this portrait, they're drawing from all those colors. And my point is, again, not everybody in the Philippines has lived and worked in Hong Kong. Everybody knows somebody who's lived and worked in Hong Kong, right? That information spreads. Not everybody in the Philippines has lived in Dubai or has lived in California, but everybody knows somebody who's lived in those places. And this produces a very real level of political sophistication that is lacking where I grew up in Ontario, Canada. Like even today, it's lacking in many parts of the world. I think it's really false to say that the people of the Philippines don't appreciate democracy, don't understand democracy. And what are we contrasting them to? Let's just contrast them briefly to these people around 1760, around 1770 in the United States of America, white, English-speaking Protestant Americans who were the people with political power, in case you didn't know. The only colors they had to work with in trying to paint an image of what a republic should be, of what a democracy should be, right? The only colors they could draw on were their own direct experience with England, their own direct experience in the 13 colonies, maybe a little bit of experience in the Caribbean. A lot of people economically were going back and forth between the 13 colonies and British colonies in the Caribbean. Maybe a few of the Spanish colonies. Maybe they'd at some point visited Cuba, set foot in Havana, due to some economic connection of trade, right? And for the most part, what they were lacking in color was made up for by stories and anecdotes drawn from this book, drawn from Plutarch. That was what they had to work with. Now, I'm not going to launch into a separate monologue on this separate issue. One of the slightly surreal examples of how this worked, this covered in my own 600-page tome, No More Manifestos. I do briefly tell the tale here of how the Americans fantasized about their own future independence, how they fantasized about their own future republic, and fantasized about their own future democracy, with the real world example of the revolution and the new constitution that was written in Corsica. All right. I actually got a very useful email from Oliver. Oliver has his own YouTube channel, Oliver Shields. He sent me a really great email backing it up with more documentary evidence. How many hundred newspaper articles at that time in the United States were regaling the American public with this largely mythical narrative about this wonderful, amazing new democracy that had been created in Corsica. Now, I say it's partly mythological, but I mean, partly Corsica is a real place that really exists. They really did have a revolution. It's just that this was really, the American imagination fueled by the stories in Plutarch, right? The American imagination set loose on the tiny island of Corsica and making it into this laboratory, this experiment in what democracy could be, in what a republic could be or should be. Okay. So what Americans are lying to themselves about the most is the extent to which the discourse that emerged during and after the revolution was overtly and intentionally anti-democratic. And that's where we get this idea, linked to Sallust here and the Catalan conspiracy, linked directly to Cicero and what he has to say about the Catalan conspiracy. In the years leading up to the drafting of the American Constitution, and I just mentioned John Adams himself is the most lamentably obvious smoking gun source on this. But frankly, you can spare yourself the agony and just read my own book chapters dealing with this. It's so awful. I mean, reading the primary source from those guys, from John Adams and so on, it's just terrible. You might flip to the chapters of the book, of my own book that deal with the origins of the American Constitution. And at least read that for a start, so you're not just completely demoralized and brokenhearted reading John Adams in his kind of feverish attempt to convince you that democracy is the worst thing America could possibly have. It's the worst political system they could possibly raise, that America should stamp out any trace of democracy whatsoever. And I have the smoking gun quotations from him where he's really saying that. He says that democracy is something that never has existed in the world, and it never will exist, and never should exist, and they shouldn't pursue this ideal at all. So already this is vitiating the imperialistic notion that America's significance is that they discovered the secret formula to take democracy from the ancient world and drag it into the modern world, reinvent it in the modern world, right? And that once America had made this discovery, a discovery that emerged from the debates between these bizarre, extremely eccentric historical figures. So think about who Benjamin Franklin was. Benjamin Franklin, who invented electricity and went around with an electric cattle prod trying to kill turkeys and proving that this was a superior way to execute farm animals. It's totally bizarre, eccentric. Sitting down in a room with a jackass like Thomas Jefferson. The perfect model for democracy emerged from Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And let's not forget the single most influential man in the writing of the American Constitution, a man whose name is totally forgotten today, Gouverneur Morris. Right? Gouverneur Morris did the most talking in those debates. He did the most writing in terms of the Constitution. Gouverneur Morris is the man who wrote the state constitution for New York, and he's the man who wrote the Constitution for the United States as a whole to a much greater extent than anyone realizes today. Totally eccentric, bizarre character. Okay, but somehow, this is like the discovery of penicillin from rotting garbage. We got just the right rotting garbage together, and we extracted from it the perfect formula for democracy. What about slavery? What about democracy? Yeah. What about women having the right to vote? Yeah, shut up with that. Okay, so there are a million ways to vitiate it, and I'm sorry, but it's not a minor issue or problem footnote here. What about the relationship between rich and poor, which is really what the debates about democracy at that time are all about? And that's why these particular examples and the use made of them mattered so much then, and why it matters so much now. This fear of the so-called strong man who's lifted up by the poor. Now, already, do you want me to write a political science essay for you on the concept of a strong man? All right. Is Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos a strong man? For one thing, he's commonly reported as being charismatic. He's not charismatic. It's just mind-blowing. Have you watched one interview from the guy? Have you watched one lecture being given to crowd. Bongbong Marcos is not a charismatic leader. It's commonly reported that he's handsome. He's not handsome. He's not the handsomest candidate in that election. Manny Pacquiao, look at Manny Pacquiao with his shirt off. Okay, Manny Pacquiao is the one who was charismatic. Manny Pacquiao is the one who was handsome. Manny Pacquiao is the one who's a strong man, and where there might be some concern for this pattern in history playing out of him subverting democracy and becoming a dictator, right? Okay, so Manny Pacquiao as Julius Caesar, okay, kind of a stretch. Now, how much does Manny Pacquiao have in common with Caesar? I'm going to come back to this. What is the significance of Caesar? Well, guess what? The people of the Philippines, almost nobody voted for Manny Pacquiao. They voted for the guy who studied at Oxford. They voted for this guy. Yes, a product of privilege, product of a wealthy upbringing. They voted for a guy who's not charismatic, who's not handsome. He's not some great orator. He's really not. It's an interesting choice. And yes, he's a man who has a name that links him to one of the most notorious and despised political leaders in the history of Asia, perhaps in the whole history of the world. Okay, well, interesting. Why is it that the American people today, and why is it that, again, I watch the news from France, I watch news from Germany, just on this issue, certainly. I've seen a lot of news stories from Germany. Why is it that these people in the decadent West are responding to Ferdinand Marcos as the Caesar-like symbol of a terrible dictator who's raised up by the poor? But oh, tragically, the poor don't know what's in their best interest themselves. The poor, in the name of democracy, are destroying the republic. Well, that was the dominant leitmotif in American politics in the years leading up to the writing of the Constitution. That was the single, that was the moral foisted onto every story, including, and I want to deal with this right now, including the story of Julius Caesar himself. Now, look, sorry, it's not actually this is a collection of the Greek lives by Plutarch. I can't endorse this translation. I don't know if it's good or bad yet. I'll tell you later if this is a good English translation or not. It's not easy to find it, but anyway. The question of what is the best English translation of Plutarch is a subject for another video. But this series, they published all the lives from Athens in one volume, and then all the lives from Rome in another. You can read the life of Julius Caesar as it's written by Plutarch, and I think you can even read what he says about Caesar in other people's lives too, where the story comes up. And you can question how is it that Caesar has become the symbol for this particular pattern. So I'm just gonna say it again, hopefully for the last time. All right. The pattern whereby the poor elect a dictator who becomes a tyrant because the poor feel that this is in their interest, right? But in fact, the poor don't know what's good for them, and this tyranny destroys the republic. All right, that's the pattern. Now, I think the secret shame that the Americans have been covering up for all these centuries is the awareness that this same pattern that all of the founding fathers were warning against again and again and again, this same pattern that was used to justify the total exclusion of the poor from politics, of making voting for Congress and voting for the Senate exclusively a game that could be participated in by a tiny number of the wealthy elite. Okay, so American democracy, according to the Constitution, the unamended Constitution, without amendments that came in much later, right? Poor people didn't vote. Middle-class people didn't vote. Only the rich could vote. This is not a minor footnote in history. Okay. Gee, why didn't they try that in Afghanistan when the Americans conquered Afghanistan? Why didn't they say, oh yeah, you guys should start the same place we started? back in the 1790s. You should only let rich people vote. That'll be great. The history of Afghanistan would have been much different in the last 20 years if they'd done that, instead of starting with this assumption of universal suffrage, of allowing everyone to vote. Universal suffrage means the poor can vote. Anyone and everyone can vote. Okay. The shame that the Americans are compensating for, or overcompensating for, is that this very pattern that the founding fathers warned against again and again and again, whether they were invoking that warning sincerely or insincerely, like whether or not they just wanted an excuse, like probably Governor Morris did, whether they just wanted an excuse to preserve the wealth and privilege of the aristocracy, whatever corrupt motives they had. Oh yeah, do I have Woody Holden here? Whether or not they were in fact part of a conspiracy that dealt with the government's war debts and who was going to get rich out of the government conquering land held by indigenous people and auctioning it off. There's a bunch of different scams that were going on at that time that influenced some people and their involvement in writing the Constitution. Interesting part of the story. Whether they were making this warning about Julius Caesar and the Catalan conspiracy, whether they were making this warning sincerely or not, they warned against it again and again and again. And with the election of the very first president of the United States of America, that is exactly what happened. Who was George Washington? George Washington was precisely a charismatic military leader backed by the army, who was lifted up into the position of presidency and who became a terrible dictator and who subverted all the principles the revolution was supposed to stand for. Okay? The Napoleon of American history, in the same sense that Napoleon subverted the principles of the revolution and perverted what was supposed to be a democracy in France. That happened in the United States of America also, but it happened with their very first president. And all of these guys who warned again and again, oh, no, we can't let there be a Julius Caesar figure, right? This is one of the most powerful leitmotifs of that period of history. It's become really like encoded in the DNA of our culture, of our civilization. And it's inculcated into people like Bongbong Marcos when they go to study at Oxford or Cambridge and get their degree in PPE, when they get their, this elite education in politics that exactly these institutions serve to pass on from one generation to the next. Possibly Wharton Business School does also. I don't know. I don't know if they read Thucydides at Wharton Business School or not. Interesting to look into to what extent Wharton Business School is actually promulgating the knowledge of classical sources of political philosophy and history. That I don't know. In fact, the worst case scenario that the founding fathers were warning against, it already happened. It happened immediately. It happened with the election of the very first president of the United States of America. And nobody dared to stand up and point the finger and say, you are the Julius Caesar of our age. Your tyranny must be torn down, must be overcome. Now, that discourse was suppressed during the presidency of George Washington. And then it was unleashed on the second president of the United States, on John Adams. In many ways, Adams was catching the blame, the pent-up blame for what had been wrong with the administration that came before him, the president before him. That's a pattern that still exists to this day. What do people mean when they complain that Bongbong Marcos is a strong man? Are you telling me George Washington was not a strong man? Like, really think about this. Bongbong Marcos, what's his relationship to the military? Really think about it, okay? Now, look, Thailand has just been through this. Myanmar is going through this right now. And both Thailand and Myanmar, just a slightly different, chronology, all right? Thailand, they have a problem with charismatic military leaders going from being the head of the army to being the head of civilian government. It's happened again and again and again in Thailand. Myanmar, they have a fragile semi-democracy for just a few years, and then one military leader or another takes it all away from them, okay? Is it fair to call Bongbong Marcos a strongman, a military dictator? What do you, is it fair to say that this is the pattern of the Catalan conspiracy? Or again, this really strange misrepresentation of what happened with Julius Caesar, that Caesar was this charismatic military leader lifted up by the poor, et cetera, et cetera. That somehow the problem with Caesar was that he was popular with poor people. Like, are you sure? Are you sure that's the moral of the story here? Are you sure that's the lesson you want to draw from this history? No. What Americans can't deal with is the legacy of their own first two presidents, and they can't deal with the extent to which the real debates that shaped the writing of their own constitution, the debates that were very directly involved in drafting their constitution, they were overtly anti-democratic. They concluded with arguments as to how important it was to distinguish a republic from a democracy and to actually establish the United States as an anti-democratic republic. Sounds paradoxical. We now think of republicanism and democracy as inextricably linked. Well, the authors of the Constitution did not think of it that way. All right. Think about who George Washington was. Think about who John Adams was. Did it cross the mind of either man that he might have sons and grandsons who would also be president of the United States of America? Do you think either man was too pure to think of dynastic politics in this way? Adams and George Washington, they are in some ways diametrically opposite responses to the same inspiring genius behind American democracy. One of the comments Adams made about George Washington, I think this is verbatim, I might be just slightly paraphrasing, was that he referred to George Washington as nothing but a lucky soldier, right? John Adams died an incredibly wealthy man. Most of the other founding fathers did not. Gouverneur Morris also died very, very wealthy. But it's significant that Thomas Jefferson died in bankruptcy. How different the rest of the future of the United States of America would be if Jefferson had died rich? It's a very interesting question. But the personal wealth and poverty, respectively, of these people, it really did matter. And it's often pointed out, frankly, what a jerk George Washington was towards his own slaves, and that he didn't liberate his slaves and he didn't give them particularly good conditions and so on, while he was at the same time making kind of namby-pamby statements about the morality of slavery. Well, George Washington was himself actually quite money hungry. His career before the Revolution, a lot of red flags. His career during the Revolution, it's one disaster after another. Nobody in their right mind could say that George Washington was a great or brilliant military leader. Nobody. His main accomplishment was starving his men to death at the Valley Forge. Oh, I'm sorry. Is this new for you guys? Hey, can I get a thumbs up from anyone in the audience who has never before heard that George Washington was a terrible military leader? Terrible military leader, terrible political leader. But yes, his relationship to even his own slaves, the slaves he owned, ultimately, his struggle to be a distinguished and wealthy person. I'm not saying it's a struggle against absolute poverty, right? This is very much part of the story there. Um, you know, John Adams believed that he was qualified to be a leader of the United States of America because of his knowledge of classical Greek and Roman literature. And he was incredibly wealthy, and his children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews and what have you, cousins and so on, they were all influenced by him, partly because he really had enough money to share with his relatives over this extended network. He made it very clear that he was establishing a family tradition where not just the boys, but also the girls would be educated in either ancient Greek or ancient Latin or both. That everyone was going to study these books, everyone was going to study these literature, and they would be qualified for high office. They would take their place in shaping the future of the United States of America because of this intellectual qualification, this intellectual accomplishment. Now, I think I've said enough to already make you dubious about in what ways this would or would not qualify you. If you take the time to read my book, again, admittedly, a 600-page book, you will be much more skeptical about the extent to which the founding fathers, the authors of the Constitution, the extent to which they knew anything about ancient Greece, anything about ancient Rome, like the extent to which they were really ignorant of Athens, Rome, and Sparta. And then also the extent to which they were just lying to themselves. Like they seemed to just be strangely deluded as to what the basic facts of that history were. And of course, how they applied to the modern world, the world they were living in at that time, so on and so forth. So that's really explored and examined in the book, I think, at sufficient length. Okay. John Adams, his claim to being the right man to lead the American Republic is based on his book, Learning. Americans hate him. Americans revile him as a tyrant. Americans punish him for a series of relatively minor controversies, right? And I am suggesting to you that the reason why he was so intensely hated and the reason why he was held to such a high standard in these controversies is because people couldn't punish George Washington while he was in office, right? They couldn't, act on, so to speak, the same concerns that a strong man, having taken over as president of the United States, was subverting the slightly democratic principles, the somewhat democratic principles, the Republican principles that were in the Constitution and that everyone had fought for in the Revolution, right? This wasn't supposed to be just an elected kingship, an elected monarchy. It was supposed to be something else. Now, what it was supposed to be was very much unsettled. It was very much still an open question at that time in America. Again, I think you get a good idea of that if you read my book. On the one hand, there was this tradition that comes straight out of Plutarch, straight out of Greece and Rome. And on the other hand, the really, like the forgotten side of history was the democratic tradition that came out of the English Civil War and was very directly linked to the Bible, was very directly linked to this really strange interpretation of Moses and the so-called republic that Moses had established in ancient Israel. And so you get a sense of the madness of that. And that's now very much been deleted and forgotten from the retelling of American history. Okay. When you look at the history of the American Empire, it's possible to tell yourself that being conquered by the Americans was the best thing that could have possibly happened to South Korea. Why? Because life in North Korea is so terrible. It's possible to tell yourself the best thing that could have possibly happened to West Germany was being conquered by the Americans. Why? Because life was so terrible in East Germany, right? And of course, life was so terrible before the Americans conquered it, under Adolf Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. It's very, very difficult for Americans to look at the Philippines and be honest with themselves. All right. Is the Philippines better off today because they were conquered by the United States of America over 100 years ago? Now, one answer is just to say no. And in general, what happened just within the last 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, within just the last few years in the Philippines, they switched from a nationalist narrative that was centrally and definitively anti-American to a nationalist narrative that is centrally and definitively anti-Chinese. Maybe 3 years is more accurate. It's been quite recent. Okay, so there was a very powerful kind of story being told in the Philippines that all of their problems were created by the Americans. Of course, again, partly because they were conquered by the Americans. They resented this humiliating conquest. They weren't allowed to be truly independent and pursue their own path in the world. Yes, but also very much focusing on demonizing and blaming these American military bases in the Philippines, that, they need a new leader to kick out the American Army, the notorious Navy base in Angeles City. That's how people pronounce it, I've always heard, in the Philippines. Army and naval and Air Force bases that are there, that this military cooperation with the United States has to end. There was a very powerful anti-American discourse in the Philippines that the early years of Duterte, right, he was riding a wave of anti-Americanism. And if you forget, he embraced a pro-China position. And he promised to kick out the American Army, get rid of the American Air Force Base. Okay, last 3 years, this has been inverted, turned inside out and upside down. Now, the story, the story of Philippine nationalism, the dominant concern, is anti-China and pro-USA. So this is a period of time when, if Americans can embrace the Philippines and can embrace Philippine democracy, right, the Filipinos can embrace you back. Has anyone here read the Constitution of the Philippines? Has anyone here looked at their actual procedures for elections? They're better than the Americans. From memory, Philippine Constitution is 1987, something like that. Someone can Google it and see if I'm wrong. Ferdinand Marcos I dies in 1989 in Hawaii, as I recall. Okay, it was very much in the context of Ferdinand Marcos fleeing the Philippines, and of a sense of regrouping and reinvigorating democracy in the Philippines, that they wrote a new constitution. All right. The people of the Philippines are poor. All right. What can I say? Wealth is not virtue. Poverty is not a vice. It's just crazy to me that nobody in America, after living through the fiasco of the election of Donald Trump, both of them, after living through the fiasco of the first election of George W. Bush, after living through all these terrifying and surreal episodes that should make you question the quality and quantity of democracy in the United States. I mean, I opened this book by asking, can any of us today truly remember what it was like in the year 2020? I know it's a short time ago. Can you remember what it was like when the streets of Portland, Oregon were filled with armed anarchists and communists? It's ridiculous, but we just lived through a period of unspeakable violence against the police, against government parliament buildings and so on. of people tearing up the cobblestones and throwing them at the police and burning down police stations. And, the level of anarchic violence in the year 2020, right? And of course, the concerns with police brutality that inspired that violence, the concerns with the quality and quantity of democracy, the quality and quantity of policing, so on and so forth. Very fundamental questions were raised in the year 2020. And there's this strange sense in which it really has been forgotten. And it's been forgotten because we don't want to remember. We don't want to reflect on it. We don't want to dwell on it. We do not want to learn the lessons of history. Can Americans be proud that there is a democracy that exists in the Philippines today that's the creation of their tutelage, right? It was an American tutorial that created democracy in the Philippines. Also American conquest, also American build. Can Americans be proud that there's democracy in South Korea as a result of American tutelage? Can Americans be proud that there is democracy in Taiwan and in Japan? All of them a result of American imperialism, American conquest, American tutelage. By the same token, what if Americans would be ashamed if they admitted to themselves that in each and every one of those examples today, there is a better functioning democracy? There is a better quality and quantity of democracy than Americans have, suffering under the same Constitution that was written by nutcases like John Adams, and then immediately subverted by the most notorious, brutal, immoral, and stupid military strongman of them all, George Washington.